Andrew S. Rancer is professor of communication at the University of Akron in Akron, Ohio. For more than 20 years, Dr. Rancer's research has focused on the role of argumentative and verbally aggressive communication and other personality traits across a wide variety of communicative contexts. He has published in Communication Monographs, Human Communication Research, Communication Education, Communication Quarterly, the Journal of Intercultural Communication Research, and the Journal of Personality Assessment, among other places. He is also one of the co-authors of the widely used book, Building Communication Theory, published by Waveland Press, and now in its fourth edition. In 2006, Dr. Rancer co-wrote Argumentative and Aggressive Communication, Theory, Research, and Application with Ted Avdgis for Sage Publications. Let's welcome Dr. Andrew S. Rancer to CommuniCast. In 1978, a conversation you had with your dissertation advisor, Dominic Infante, led to the creation of one of the most researched variables in communication today, argumentativeness. What is argumentativeness, and how has your understanding of argumentativeness changed in the last 30 years?
Well, you're absolutely right in talking about the genesis of this research program. It was way back, and it's hard to imagine that it's now almost 31 years ago, when Dominic Infante and I were working on some research looking at interpersonal communication competence. This even precedes my dissertation by about a year or so. And we looked at the literature on interpersonal competence, and we, looked at factors such as empathy and openness and self-disclosure, and all of them were very positive, constructive factors. And we reasoned that there was not enough attention at that point paid to communication that takes place when conflict exists. And of course, we know that conflict exists in a lot of different communication situations. So we started looking at the idea of aggressive communication, which includes argumentativeness and verbal aggression, as well as two other traits that I'll explain in a little bit. Essentially, what we did is we looked at predispositions to engaging in argumentative communication. And argumentativeness we defined as a generally stable trait which stimulates individuals when they are in a conflict situation to verbally challenge or attack the positions that other people take on those issues. So again, in argumentativeness, the locus of the attack is on another person's, your adversary's position on an issue. This area then grew because we developed it as a personality predisposition, and consequently we developed a scale that measures argumentativeness, and then a few years later the companion trait called verbal aggressiveness was developed by Professor Infante and Professor Charles Wigley at the time in 1986.
So what is verbal aggression, and how is it different than argumentativeness?
Yeah, verbal aggressiveness, and we looked at that initially in my dissertation and as we were developing the scale. Verbal aggressiveness is the tendency or predisposition for individuals to verbally attack the self-concept of another individual in order to cause psychological harm, damage, self-esteem loss to the other person. And as you could see by the definition of verbal aggressiveness, the locus of the attack is not on the adversary's position on a controversial issue. Rather, it's on the adversary's self-concept instead of or in addition to their position on an issue. So verbal aggression or verbal aggressiveness as the trait is really a destructive form of communication, where argumentativeness, we reason, and going back to the history of our discipline with Aristotle's lines of topoi in terms of argument, we reason is a very constructive form of communication. And we have, quite a bit of research over the last several years that reaffirms this position that argumentativeness is a constructive communication trait, and verbal aggressiveness really in almost all contexts is a destructive communication trait.
In 2006, you and Ted Avdgis wrote Argumentative and Aggressive Communication, Theory, Research, and Application for Sage Publications. Within the book, you write, "It is the purpose of this book to review the journey that has been taken toward the development of what is called the theory of argumentative and aggressive communication." What is the theory of argumentative and aggressive communication?
Well, perhaps we were a little bold in our text to assert that it's a theory, but let me try to explain what I meant by that. The theory of aggressive communication is a relative term that through the inductive research process by ourselves and by many, many scholars in the United States and now around the world as well, we have developed a rather comprehensive conceptualization of what we call aggressive communication. This conceptualization, and I'll call it a theory, if you will, allows us because it allows us to better understand, explain, predict, and ultimately control, which of course are the goals of theory, an individual's aggressive communication predispositions and their behavior across a variety of different communication contexts. This conceptualization or theoretical model, if you will, is composed of both trait and situational factors. Now, we tend to focus, as many people have done in looking at these aggressive communication traits, on the trait component. And the trait component involves understanding 4 different distinct traits, 2 of which are considered constructive, as I just mentioned, and 2 of which are considered destructive. Now, the 2 constructive communication traits that comprise this conceptual model are assertiveness, which is the trait of being interpersonally dominant and forceful, and argumentativeness, which I suggested is the trait in which you attack positions of other people during communication conflict episodes. The 2 destructive traits that form this model or theoretical conceptualization are hostility, which hostility is considered obviously a negative, a destructive trait. It's classified as using messages to express irritability, negativity, resentment, and suspicion. And as I just mentioned, verbal aggressiveness, which is the tendency or predisposition to engage in attacks on an adversary's self-concept. Now, in addition to looking at these 4 trait predispositions as to how they come into play in social conflict episodes, the conceptualization or theory of aggressive communication also looks at several situational factors. We consider it an interactionist approach to understanding aggressive communication behavior because it not only focuses on a person's trait predispositions but also on situational factors. Now, there's several situational factors that can impact on both argumentativeness and verbal aggressiveness. For argumentativeness, there are certain situational factors such as, in terms of determining how argumentative you are actually going to be in a particular situation, not in general, because we have the trait that would measure that, but in terms of, in a particular situation, characteristics and attributes of the person that you're arguing with, such as how attractive you find them, their age, how similar you are to them in terms of your predisposition to argue, the topic that you're arguing. Certain topics will generate more argumentative behavior than others. How much prior knowledge do you have on a given topic? The saliency or the importance of the argument to the individuals involved. You know, some arguments are seen as very, very salient, and even though they may be seen as trivial, the topic, for example, squeezing the toothpaste, some people think, oh, that's just who cares? But in certain families or certain relationships, if you squeeze the toothpaste from the middle and your partner prefers you squeeze it from the bottom, that could turn into quite a contentious situation. And there's certain environmental factors as well, such as where the argument takes place, as well as certain relational factors, such as, how involved are you with this individual? Are you involved in an intimate relationship or a non-intimate relationship? Are you a colleague or coworker of them as well? Then, in addition to those situational factors that might impact on determining an individual's argumentative communication and predisposition in that particular situation, we also have looked at certain global factors such as, Importance of success, how important is it for you to win that argument in that particular situation? Importance of failure, how important would it be if you lose that argument? Probability of success, how likely is it that you're going to win that argument given this topic, given this situation, given this adversary? And probability of failure, how likely is it that you will not win the argument? Now that's for argumentativeness. Now there's also situational factors that impact on an individual's verbally aggressive communication trait. Some of those are how hostile is your personality. Remember that hostility and verbal aggressiveness are two distinct traits. And so you may be high in verbal aggressiveness, but you may be a little bit lower in hostility. So how hostile are you? If you're very hostile, then you're probably going to engage in more verbal aggression. What about self-esteem? How is your self-esteem? What about verbal ability? Those people with lower verbal ability tend to be more verbally aggressive. And of course, there's also some situational factors that add to this model. The degree of frustration. How frustrated are you in this conflict situation? How much revenge do you want to take on this person that you're having a conflict with? And of course, there's always those other conditions such as alcohol and other forms of substance abuse that could impact on an individual's use of verbal aggression. And of course, societal conditions such as poverty and prejudice also impact on that. So the theory of aggressive communication takes into account these four traits plus a myriad of situational factors that could impact on an individual's aggressive communication, both verbal aggression and argumentativeness, across most communication contexts.
Now, the second part of your 2000 book looks at how argumentativeness and aggressiveness has been researched in a variety of communicative contexts, including interpersonal relationships, organizations, and the classroom. What are some general themes that you've seen across these different contexts?
Well, that's a good question because, there's certain findings that we have, as you mentioned, regarding in each of those specific contexts. Before I give you some global ones, can I give you an example of something that we've learned in terms of family, ARG and VA and family context? Would you mind if I shared a little bit of that? Because I think this is one of the most important and compelling areas of research that we've done. We have found, or we feel comfortable rather, saying that within the family, verbal aggression is considered very destructive, and argumentativeness is most often considered constructive. Let me give you just a few examples here, and then I'll talk to you about some of the general themes, perhaps, that we can say that cuts across all the contexts, including organizational, interpersonal, intercultural, etc. In one of the most comprehensive efforts designed to understand the role of argumentativeness and verbally aggressive communication in marriage, Professor Infante and his colleagues, they conducted a series of studies in which they looked at violent and nonviolent couples. In one study, which Dr. Infante conducted with Teresa Chandler-Saberin and Jill Rudd, they surveyed women who were residing in a shelter as victims of domestic violence and who reported being physically assaulted by their partners. These women completed the measures of ARG and VA, our scales, and they found that there was more verbal aggressiveness reported in violent and nonviolent marriages or relationships. And this finding lends credence to the idea that I didn't mention earlier, that verbal aggressiveness is considered a catalyst to physical aggression. It doesn't mean that all verbal aggression will translate into physical aggression, but it serves as a stimulant to then the next step in terms of using physical aggression. But in that study, the most striking finding that we feel is that supports this idea of the argumentative skill deficiency model, which says basically that individuals who lack motivation and skill in arguing, they're low in argumentativeness, these individuals probably will use more verbal aggression. The results from that study showed that violent marriages were more likely comprised of one spouse being low in argumentativeness while the other spouse was highly verbally aggressive. And along these lines, in terms of family communication, The role of verbal aggressiveness and frustration and anger also has been investigated by several studies, primarily by the research team of Rudd, Vogelbauer, Dobos, Beatty, and Valencic. They studied parents' trait verbal aggressiveness, and they found that verbal aggressiveness, the trait, was more strongly related to anger under highly frustrating conditions, and that the higher the parent's level of verbal aggressiveness, the more easily that frustration was converted to anger, and anger, again, is a stimulant to verbal aggression. That's one of the newer things that we've talked about, and I'll share some of that later on. We believe now that anger management is a key element in controlling verbal aggression. And finally, one other one in terms of the family context, Beatty, Zelli, Dobos, and Rudd found that a son's perception of his father's sarcasm and criticism and perceived verbal aggressiveness is really based firmly in the father's trait, verbal aggressiveness. As the father's use of criticism and sarcasm and verbal aggression increased, so too did the father's level of verbal aggressiveness. So that context in particular has yielded some very, very important findings. But in general, I would say that there are a few themes that cut across contexts. One of them is, as I said, that for the most part, argumentativeness is considered constructive, verbal aggressiveness destructive. The only negative aspect of argumentativeness that we've been able to find so far involves the idea that if you are an outlier on the argumentativeness scale in terms of being too high, if you're a plus 30, a plus 40, that you may argue too much. Even though you're attacking the adversary's position, you're doing it too much, and that could impair interpersonal relationships with individuals. Another general finding is that we found that individuals differ in their beliefs about arguing. There's a set of 7 beliefs that we've been able to identify, and high argumentatives believe that arguing is a learning experience. It's a way of demonstrating my rhetorical skill. It's a way of resolving conflict, where individuals who are low in argumentativeness think just the opposite. They see arguing as a way that they fluster and fumble in their communication behavior during conflict. It's a way of lowering their self-esteem and their competence, etc. We also find some gender differences, and we found both gender differences in terms of sex, with males and females differing, with males being higher in both traits than females, and also psychological gender orientation. So some research suggests that it doesn't matter your biological sex, but your psychological gender orientation, where individuals who have that instrumental dimension, they're higher in the instrumental dimension, formerly called masculinity. They tend to be higher in both argumentativeness and verbal aggressiveness as well. And finally, we've found that across situations that argumentativeness and verbal aggressiveness are related to many other communication traits, positively in terms of argumentativeness with communication competence, cognitive flexibility, self-esteem, talkaholism or compulsive communication, need for cognition from the elaboration likelihood model, and also extroversion, and negatively correlated with self-handicapping and external locus of control, that was verbal aggressiveness, external locus of control, and argumentativeness negatively correlated, of course, with communication apprehension. So, again, much of the research has looked at these two traits as they function in certain contexts, but those are some of the general themes that have developed across contexts.
Some of the more recent research in both argumentativeness and aggressiveness has examined the biological underpinnings of both concepts. With such a strong biological component to both concepts, is it possible to modify argumentative and aggressive communicative behavior?
Well, that's another very excellent question. First of all, I would say that the research so far has lent support to your assertion, especially as it relates to verbal aggressiveness. Dr. McCroskey and Dr. Beatty and Dr. Heisel have done a lot of research where they do believe that there is a genetic component, there is a neurobiological component to verbal aggressiveness. That has not been really discovered yet for argumentativeness. I'm not sure whether the research hasn't been done or they haven't found that yet. But so for verbal aggressiveness, there tends to be a stronger component that suggests that there may be a genetic influence. Of course, there's also an influence of social learning to some degree, and an influence on the argumentative skill deficiency, as we talked about. Now, can we alter an individual's level of argumentativeness? The answer to that is yes, and we did that actually. Wow, it seems like yesterday, but it was actually 12 years ago when we went into a Pittsburgh middle school. We went into a suburb of Pittsburgh, and we went into a middle school, and we essentially did a study where we had two groups of students. These were kids in 7th grade. And we divided them into two groups, the experimental group and a control group. And the experimental group got training in argumentativeness. What we did is essentially taught them a method we taught them about what argumentativeness is and what verbal aggressiveness is, the constructive aspects and destructive aspects of both traits and both behaviors. And then we trained the group, the experimental group, in Infante's inventional system, which is a model that allows you to generate arguments. And what we did is we modified the inventional system to create a little mnemonic device, so it became, instead of problem, blame, solution, and consequences, it became the peanut butter soda crackers diner. So we trained them how to argue using this inventional system. And then we measured, at the end of the training, we measured their ability to generate arguments and their level of trait argumentativeness. We were very pleased to report that, indeed, the results of the training indicate that they were able to double the number of arguments that they were able to generate on the fly. So we gave them a topic. We said, list all the arguments that you could generate. And between pre and post test, they doubled the amount from 2. Actually, they almost tripled the amount, from 2 to 6. So that was significant. We also looked at their level of trait argumentativeness after the training, and in fact, it did go up, and it went up significantly. Unfortunately, and lending some credence to the communibiological explanation, verbal aggression was not impacted by our training, and indeed, a year later, when we went back to, there was no significant difference, rather, between pre- and post-tests on verbal aggressiveness. We thought it would go down. It didn't. And then a year later, when we went back to visit the same kids again for a follow-up study, verbal aggression even went up a little bit more. So again, maybe because they were in the 8th grade now, I don't know. But again, it is more resistant to training than argumentativeness. Now, in all fairness, though, we really did not train them on how to avoid verbal aggression or what to do in that. In fact, right now, we're working on plans to develop a training program specifically looking at teaching kids how to modify or diminish their use of verbal aggression. But that's yet to be tested. But you're right, there does seem to be a biological component for verbal aggressiveness, not so yet for argumentativeness. But training can, in fact, make individuals more motivated to argue, and by using the inventional system, more skilled in arguing as well.
Now that you've been researching argumentative and aggressive communicative behavior for 30 years, where do you think the research needs to head in the future?
Well, I have some help answering this question because, indeed, if I may put a shameless plug in now, Professor Abdus and I are going to have a follow-up book that will hopefully come out in about a year from the Routledge Company. And we've asked scholars who have been doing this research over the last several years, we've asked them to contribute their thoughts on this, and they complied, and we have some very, very good ideas as to what they're suggesting, including looking at biological components as well. But let me just talk about two, if I may. One of them deals with my own research recently, where myself, young Lynn from the University of Akron, James Durbin from now at West Virginia University, and one of my former undergraduates, Emily Faulkner. What we did is, for a 2-year period, we looked at understanding the nonverbal component of aggressive communication, which heretofore had not yet been studied. And what we did in that period was develop a taxonomy of 51 what we call nonverbal verbal aggression, such as looks of disdain, rolling of the eyes, giving the evil eye, walking away, of course, giving the emblems such as the middle finger, some of the paralinguistic cues, the sarcasm in the voice, etc. So what we've done is develop a taxonomy now of the top 20, if you will, nonverbal, verbal aggressive behaviors from facial, eye, vocalic, kinesic, and what we call disconfirmation. Another area that I think is very exciting that we're working on right now that will be featured in the book is the work by Dr. Charles Wigley, who, as you know, was the co-developer of the verbal aggressiveness construct with Dom Infante. And he's been doing research, which one of my grad students has also been doing, on what they call VTEs, or verbal trigger events. These are statements that a person makes to another person which lead to these explosive verbal responses. And essentially what VTEs are is adding a situational component to verbal aggression. Verbal aggressiveness is a trait. And now what Dr. Wigley's doing is he's looking at what are some of the situational factors that increase this frustration to the point where individuals will lash out at someone using these explosive, verbally aggressive responses. And probably also another area that is being looked at, and a lot of research has been done now by several scholars, but Tim Levine and his colleagues have looked at other methods of measuring both traits. That the scales are now, in some cases, the scales are almost 30 years old, both scales, and as a consequence, things change, measurement changes, and dimensionality changes. Other ways of looking at measuring these both traits. For example, a very exciting thing that's happening right now is Professor Abgis is even doing what he calls fMRIs, or functional MRIs, looking at subjects' brains in an MRI situation when they're listening to a verbally aggressive exchange and seeing what parts of their brain light up. That's well beyond my capability, but that's also another way of measuring and looking at verbal aggression. So those are a few of the new directions I think that this research is taking, as well as many other wonderful studies that and wonderful suggestions that will be highlighted in that book.
And when will that book be out?
They're hoping to have it by May of 2010.
Great. Well, we look forward to reading that one as well. We've been talking to Dr. Andrew Rancer about his 30-year work on argumentativeness and aggressive communication. Thank you today for joining us on CommuniCast.
Thanks so much.
CommuniCast is a production of the Communication and Media Department at SUNY